Hi everyone, and welcome to our week where we are going to be writing the first draft of the literature review. So just to jump in, I want to make sure that everyone understands the assignment. So let's hop over into the assignment on Canvas. Okay, so this is stage 1, literature review. This is due at the end of this week. Okay, so here we can see that you need to consult at least 8 peer-reviewed sources and discuss the existing literature relevant to your research question. So last week, between my lectures and Jaleesa's lectures, you should have a sense now of like how to find peer-reviewed sources either through Google Scholar or through the U of I library, okay? The literature review does need to be in paragraph form and with in-text APA style citations. There's going to be another video lecture this week that talks about APA style citations. So make sure to watch that. Now, remember that a few weeks ago, we talked about annotated bibliographies, and that's like summaries of different articles. Now, a literature review is not just like an annotated bibliography like you do for other classes. Literature reviews are grouping those findings and those articles according to camps or schools of thought, right? Which is why it says this is where you identify and describe debates and what researchers have had. Debates that researchers have had and where you find common themes, right, or camps or schools of thought, okay? In other words, instead of listing those 8 articles like an annotated bibliography, you're finding common themes among them and grouping them according to the theme, okay? So the basic idea here is that you consult at least 8 peer-reviewed sources. You correctly cite them using APA citations. Again, watch the video lecture. Paragraph form, this should be in paragraphs. It's going to outline what other scholars have said before, what they examine, what they find. We'll talk about that a little bit too. And identifying those relevant themes or camps or schools of thought. And then it's going to end with a discussion of the gap in the scholarship and how your research fills that gap. Now, just to give you a sense of the rubric here, style, 20 points, APA citations, 10 points, consultation of 8 peer-reviewed sources, 15 points. So the bulk of this here is like, did you find 8 good peer-reviewed sources? Are you telling me what they examined or found? What are other scholars' previous contributions, right here? Organization according to schools of thought, right? What are the camps? What are the themes? What are the schools of thought? That's 25 points. So altogether, the bulk of it is like, that's 65 points where you tell me what other scholars have found previously and you group it by theme, okay? Now, the last one is always a little bit trickier, discussion of the gap where you're contributing. If you're struggling with this, it's not a big deal for now. This is only worth 5 points at this point. But I do want you to think, what is your contribution to scientific knowledge? How are you pushing this forward in some way? Okay. Now, for last week, right, you did learn how to use library databases and Google Scholar to find peer-reviewed sources. Just a reminder, they have to be peer-reviewed sources. They can't be things that you find through Google, for instance, okay? Like they have to be through peer-reviewed sources like through Google Scholar or like through those U of I databases, okay? Now, for this lecture, we're going to talk about how to write a literature review, possible options for structures, and then finally, how to identify gaps, right, for scientific knowledge for you to contribute. Now, the basic structure of a literature review outlines the scholarly debate on your research question, okay? And that first paragraph especially, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail in a second, you're going to tell me what I'm about to read, okay? So it's going to tell me, like, what is your research question? How many schools of thought are there? And what are those schools of thought in that first paragraph, okay? It's a summary of your whole literature review, and I'll show you it broken out in a second. Then the next 2 to 4 paragraphs, you're going to tell me what those relevant schools of thought are, okay? How many are there? Are there 2? Are there 3? Are there 4? Okay? And what does each school of thought argue? And then finally, you're going to conclude this section with what are the weaknesses in these analyses, okay? What's the current gap that you're going to be filling here? To be clear, I'm not expecting that you need to critique every single article on every single thing, right? But I am telling you, critique it in a way, in a narrow and tailored way, so it sets up your contribution, right? So you're saying something like, a lot of research previously shows that voter ID laws have no effect on turnout, but nobody has looked at the 2024 election just yet, okay? So that's a weakness, right? None of these analyses to date have looked at the 2024 election, okay? Now, I am not picky about style, but I want to give you some hints about style so that you make this a fairly accessible read, not only to me, but eventually I'd like you all to be trying to publish in the undergraduate research journal. And style does matter, right? It makes it easier for readers and reviewers to read your work, okay? So you can give it a title, this next section of literature review. It's a bit unimaginative, right? But it's fine if you do, if you do end up with just literature review. But a lot of people will opt for things like, if you're looking at, again, voter ID laws, which is the example for this lecture, it might be something like the role of voter ID laws on turnout, right? Like the effect of voter ID laws on turnout, right? It's quick and it shows you like this is what you're about to read. Now, you're going to have 2 to 4 different schools of thought or camps, that kind of thing. And it might be a good idea to use subheadings to delineate them. So if the last one was a header, right, or a heading that says the effect of voter ID laws on turnout, right? And some scholars find that it has a role and some scholars find that it doesn't, then you might use subheadings that are like the negative effects of voter ID laws on turnout, right? That would be your first one. The null effects of voter ID laws on turnout, and that's your second subheading. So you're delineating these different schools of thought with a subheading, okay? Now, the general structure is it has about 3 sections, okay? The introduction, which is actually a summary of the rest of the literature review. I do not encourage you to write this first. You should instead write it last, and I'll give you an example template in a second. The second section is actually the meat of it all, right? The presentation of each school of thought, right? Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3. School of thought 1, 2, 3. Okay. And that's going to be this part, section 2, will be about 1.5 to 2 pages, somewhere in there. Okay. And then that final section, that last paragraph, you are going to discuss the weaknesses in these schools of thought, right? The gap that currently exists. And that's where your research is going to slot in. Okay. Now, in terms of the outline of that first paragraph of the literature review, as I just mentioned, write it last, okay? Because it is a summary of the rest of the literature review. That first sentence, you want to restate your research question, okay? Tell me what your research question is. Tell the reader what your research question is. Second sentence, how many schools of thought are there? There are 2 primary strands of scholarship. There are 3 primary strands of scholarship. And then the 3rd to 6th sentences, you tell me what each school of thought says or finds, okay? And it's a sentence for each school of thought. So here is an example. Here, I am asking why turnout varies from state to state with a focus on the impacts of voter ID law. That is my research question. There are 3 strands of literature examining such question. Okay? That is telling me how many strands of scholarship, how many camps, how many schools of thought there are. First, some scholars argue that voter ID laws don't affect turnout. That's camp 1. Second, other scholars show that voter ID laws in fact negatively affect turnout. That's camp 2. Finally, a handful of scholars find that the effect of voter ID laws on turnout is highly contextual, with it having negative effects in some places and not others. Camp 3, okay? And I will give you a template to work in for this literature review to sort of help you flesh it out in this way, in this structure. Now, the next 3 to 4 paragraphs are really the bulk of the literature review, okay? But each paragraph following that introduction is likely its own school of thought. You're not going to be mixing camps here, right? You're not going to be mixing these paragraphs. Each paragraph is its own school of thought. So who are the most important authors? Now, there are typically some things that are most commonly cited that might be included, but there might be like a strong debate somewhere and you would want to cite that. But you don't need to overthink this part specifically. Now, I would tell you, you don't need to criticize or praise or use emotional language in discussing the examinations and the findings of these scholars, right? Explain what their argument is, explain what their findings are, but don't judge it in either a positive or a negative way at this point, right? You are telling them what previous findings there have been, okay? Now, the order in which you present the schools of thought is entirely up to you, but I do want you to remember from a week or two ago when they had the narrowing funnel, and it was talking about the literature review specifically. If you have an area where you specifically want to contribute, so let's say that you are going to argue that voter ID laws had an effect in a certain place, like let's say in Texas in 2024, but otherwise they haven't really had an effect, right? You might want to put a camp that's like voter ID laws have effects sometimes and not others, that contextual camp, right at the end of your literature review, because that's a really nice transition to like, hey, look, voter ID laws are highly contextual in their effects. And I'm making a similar argument with Texas in 2024, which no one else has examined just yet. Okay. Now this part of the literature review is going to take up the most space in your paper. Again, about 1.5 to 2 pages is going to be like for you describing the camps. Okay. And then finally, you just want to tell the reader why or explain why these publications in a given section constitute a school of thought. So you can have a topic sentence like that says something like, a group of scholars finds some scholars find that voter ID laws have a negative effect on voter turnout. For instance, Smith 2022 finds, right, like that it has a negative effect. Okay. So there you just want to lay out what the broad theme is and explain how those findings from those scholars fit within that theme. Okay, some possible outlines. We've already talked last week about a variety of different outlines. If you haven't seen that video lecture yet, please make sure to go do that. But here are a couple of sort of basic ones, especially if you know sort of where you're headed. Paragraph 1 is that short introduction like we just talked about. Paragraph 2, some scholars find that voter ID laws decrease turnout. Paragraph 3, another camp of scholars finds that voter ID laws have no effect on turnout. And then finally, voter ID laws have effects sometimes. This third camp, that voter ID laws, their effects are largely contextual. And then you have a short conclusion that can either go at the end of paragraph 4 or stand on its own in paragraph 5, depending on how long it is, where you identify what the shortcomings are of these camps and where your contribution is going to be, right? But still nobody has examined the effects of voter ID laws in Texas in 2024, something like that. Now, you might not have such a clear sense of where your camps or schools of thought are. And if you have sort of like a more open literature review, which is okay, you still have that same introductory paragraph where you tell me how many camps there are, you tell me what your research question is, and you describe very briefly those camps. And maybe your question is something like, why is turnout higher in some places than in others? Paragraph 2, turnout is affected by economies. Okay, so maybe turnout is higher in places where the economy has had a downturn. Turnout is affected by education and resources of citizenry. So maybe places that are more educated and have higher incomes, they're more likely to participate in elections. Paragraph 4, turnout is affected by state election policy. So locations, polls, hours, barriers, concurrence of other elections. And then there's a short conclusion where you highlight what the weaknesses are, what the gap is, and where you're going to be contributing. This is a little bit more of an open one, but either one is appropriate. Now, at the end, you're going to briefly give your intellectual assessment of the literature. So which is the weakest camp, or which one you're going to be building from theoretically. Okay. Does there seem to be anything that previous scholars have ignored? Which one do you think is most relevant for what you're exploring? And what do you the general question is, what do you think is missing from the literature that hasn't been taken into account yet? Now, in terms of how you identify these gaps, how you make these critiques, these are some really common options that we've seen in the past. So for instance, the first one, no one else has thought of this variable before, right? Nobody else has looked at how economic anxiety affects vote choice. A lot of the pre-existing work has focused on unemployment outcomes, real household income, GDP, but nobody has yet examined how economic anxiety specifically affects vote choice. Okay. The second one, no one else has thought of joining this strand of literature from one field to this separate strand of literature from another. So some of you might be double majors in two pretty distinct fields. So maybe you're doing something like a double major in English and one in political science. And here you might say something like, oh, well, I want to analyze how popular books in fiction over the years have portrayed the office of the presidency, and nobody has looked at this before. Okay, you're taking strands from research from political science as well as research from English. Nobody has looked at this before. That's a pretty dramatic example. You can also imagine it's just two strands of scholarship in political science haven't been joined together yet to look at this specific question. The third one is really, really common, and I would guess about a quarter to a third of students will submit something like this. So most analyses are older and don't include data from this time point on. Okay. So this is especially relevant if you want to look at anything from the 2024 election, or maybe you have a pretty standard research question that's been asked a lot, but nobody's looked at 2024 just yet, or 2020, something of that nature. The fourth one is most scholarship looks at this unit of analysis and you want to apply it to another unit of analysis. So maybe you really like a theory or some research that focuses on Europe and you want to see how it applies to Asia. Right? Maybe a theory of international relations. Or maybe there's a lot of good scholarship on inequality in Latin America, and you want to see if that same theory, those same findings apply to American cities, right? So maybe you're taking some findings from another geography and seeing if they apply in a different one, or maybe you're taking them to just a different level of government entirely, okay? This group of scholars says X causes Y, but I think X causes Y in only this one context. This is quite common, especially for if you're doing your first publication in graduate school. So for instance, the example reading that you had from last week about same-day voter registration and how that affects turnout, their argument is same-day voter registration boosts turnout, but only among some populations, and specifically young people. They say same-day voter registration doesn't really do much among older populations because they've already registered to vote. Same-day voter registration policies largely benefit younger populations, okay? And that's what this is saying, right? Yeah, same-day voter registration improves turnout, but it only improves it among young people. Okay. Now, the last two are far less common, but I do want to mention them because they will appear quite frequently in articles that you read. Things like other scholarship measures X or Y this way, but we should measure it another way. Again, you don't need to do this for your work because it likely requires a class on measurement theory. And then finally, there are issues with model specifications, right? So unless you're doing political science 336 or 3360, this is about regressions, right? And how you specify regressions, and is unlikely to come up in your analyses here. Now, some tips for writing, stylistically, I would not encourage huge block quotes or a quote from each piece you cite. So anytime a student pulls quotes directly from the piece and quotes them, this is more a sign that you didn't understand the article and relying on the language of the writers to get you through, okay? Instead, I want you to paraphrase, okay? Paraphrase their findings into your own words. The only time you really want to use quotes is for emphasis. It is not for summary, okay? You do it for emphasis, not for summary, and most of what a literature review is summary, not emphasis, okay? The second piece of advice is don't try to cram all of your articles into 1 or 2 sentences. If your if your outline of 2, 3, 4 camps is supposed to be 1.5 to 2 pages, you don't want one of your camps to just be scholars show that the amount of candidate raises improves their odds of winning, and then include all of the citations here, right? You want to walk me through each one, right? You want to say Smith 2018 in their examination of candidates in California found, right? You want to tell me what they were examining and what they were finding for each of the articles. Don't just group them together all at once like this, right? You want to tell me what each of them found, okay? And this builds up to the next point. Make sure to discuss what the scholars examine and find. Make sure to tell me what the scholars examine and find. Sometimes students will just tell me what the scholars examined, but won't tell me the finding part, what the findings were. And this is a lot like telling a joke, but not ever giving the punchline. It's something like, in their examination of local democracy in Connecticut in 1970, Downs found, and then you just stop, right? Isn't that so uncomfortable, right? You want to tell me what they examined and found, okay? What was the finding? In their examination of democracy in Connecticut in the 1960s or 70s, Downs finds more pluralistic negotiating strategies, right? You want to tell me what they were looking at. They had data from 1980 in Texas. They had data from 2020 in across the United States. And then you tell me what they found. Did they find support for the camp? Did they not find support for the camp? Okay. The fourth point is start each section or paragraph out with a topic sentence that tells us where this camp of scholars falls. Okay. That tells us where this camp of scholars falls. So that helps me, along with the subheading, know what all of these scholars have in common. This strand of scholarship demonstrates that voter ID laws have a null effect on turnout, okay? That's a great topic sentence, right? That's a great topic sentence. And it tells me, and then, for instance, Carey, 2022, finds, right? Like negative effects. In other words, like you want to tell me what the general theme is among all of those scholars, and then how each of the articles supports that theme. Okay. Again, and I mentioned this already, feel free to use subheadings to help delineate those camps. Okay. Now, for this time, we went over the basic structure of the literature review as well as identifying gaps, but I do just want to quickly turn over back to your activity for the week 5, outlining your literature review. You have a worksheet that is literally an outline of what we just described in this video lecture. Paragraph 1, introductory. What is your research question? Okay. How many schools of thought are there? Briefly tell me what each school of thought says in 2 to 4 sentences. Okay. That's just what we talked about in this video lecture, right? This is your introductory paragraph, and this is going to help you outline your ultimate submissions for your literature review. Paragraph 2, camp 1. What's the main punchline of this paragraph? How would you describe the camp? This is your topic sentence for this paragraph. That's sentence 1, right? And then you say, for instance, comma, Carey, 2022, finds that voter ID laws have a negative effect on voter turnout in Maine in 2018, right? Here. Right? And you're going to do that for each article. You're going to tell me what they examined, what they found. What did they examine? What did they find? What did they examine? What did they find? Okay. Then you're going to shift over to camp 2, right? What's the main punchline of the paragraph? What's your topic sentence? Then you're going to walk me through the different pieces here. Article 1, examine, find. Article 2, examined, find. Okay. Now, here I have 3 camps with 3 sources each, but you might have 2 camps with 4 sources each, or 4 camps with 2 sources each. So you can be flexible with this, but this is just sort of a general outline. And then you have this final, like, paragraph 5, what are some weaknesses that you found in your literature review? And what is it that previous scholarship hasn't addressed? What is your gap that you're going to be contributing to here? So this is just a general outline. You fill this out and submit it for the week. But then you just write this up. Like, if you can fill this out, write this up in paragraph form, that is your literature review, and you will also submit this week. So this is meant to like build into your literature review, where all you need to do is fill this out and then write it up in paragraph form. Okay. If you have any questions, please come see me or send me an email. Happy to talk about it at any time this week. Otherwise, good luck on your literature reviews, everyone.